Hi, this is going to be lesson number 33 for module 2.10 of Radio 2 for HBAR 230. And we're going to talk about utilities, news, sport, traffic and weather as part of the programming clock. The couple of questions one asks is, how do journalists on the radio decide what is newsworthy? How do they decide which order of operations we should be following for a story to qualify as being newsworthy, and how do we position it within a bulletin, and how much of news should be going to news editors and therefore the news department versus non-news presenters to be discussing. I mean, you consider how radio works. Lots of it is sense of day content, lots of it's relevant to presenters who are doing music shows. It's really the thing that underpins the overall radio structure. So if you're doing content that lives at, say, 6:24 for the breakfast show, where you recap the top 3 stories from overnight, how does that affect news headlines at 6:30? What's the relationship like? There's an old belief system that to get this right, you have to ask a couple of key questions. Is it new? Is it unusual? Is it interesting? Of course, interest is a major part of our industry. Is it significant, and is it about people? Does it affect those people? The more newsworthy elements the story has, the more we say yes to that, the more that story becomes valuable to listeners. If it's not new, it's not news. If it isn't new, it can't be newsworthy. So a story from 3 weeks ago without an update doesn't qualify as being newsy, so it must be new. If it's unusual, it's a win. For something to be unusual, it must be uncommon. It must be something out of the ordinary. Maybe odd, not always odd, but definitely atypical. And what does that mean? Well, you know, a water outage in Sandton may not be necessarily an oddity anymore. It's pretty standard. When load shedding was happening frequently, it stopped becoming breaking news. Whereas if it happened now, since there's been an element of scarcity involved, it becomes newsworthy. Part of the reason big news events like the G20 summit are newsworthy is because they're uncommon. They break the standard model of a story. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we get flooded with lots of very, very heavy news stories. But if you were to compare, unfortunately, a story of a terrible crash in Mpumalanga, it would be far less newsworthy than if that crash happened in Suva in Fiji, where there are fewer cars, fewer people, and fewer accidents. So it must be something unusual. Interest is a key element. Knowing what your listener likes, knowing for whom you are writing, reporting, or presenting. And we know that we know our audience well in radio. Kaya FM, for example, programs for an older black person, whereas a station like RSG might be programming for an even older Afrikaans-speaking, white-leaning person. That means that you need to know what stories are of interest to those people and communicate effectively on those terms. And it must be significant, something that people are interested in enough to warrant this story to be broken. And if something is to be made on the radio, it must be done from a person of significance. Many times over, you'll hear a spokesperson from the police talking about something. That's typical of the environment we're operating in, because the person making the statement must be of significance. News should be about characters. It's a great trick by Valerie Geller. The listeners should care about these characters. We should establish stakes in these characters. Even if they're unnamed, they're still important beats in the story. You know, I suppose naming them makes a big difference. It helps the process along a lot. But it certainly needs to be about human experience. If people feel that sense of empathy, they're far more likely to be moved by the news and find it valuable to their lives. If it affects their health, their safety, if it affects their emotions, then it should potentially cause concern in other people. So you're thinking about things like financial standing, safety, health, all the primal themes we sometimes refer to in this course. If the news affects those factors of a certain person, it will have a knock-on effect on all listeners who can relate to that. Using this, you must think about whether or not your story has a strong subject, who it's about, is there new information, who cares, like does anyone care about this, will it matter to people, if not, squash it. Would you have a conversation about this off air? It's a tricky one, because how many political moves that happen every single day in South Africa are going to warrant discussions? Flo Chavambu leaving MK is talkable, as an example, but the DA caucus leader on the performance of agriculture in Mpumalanga, less repeatable and therefore less captivating as a story. And how are people, and who are the people involved in the story? Do we care about them, and should the listeners care about them? Can we make them care about those people involved? Some newsworthiness can be defined by the following: how it affects people, the reaction it evokes in people looking for that definite emotional reaction, the shock factor associated with it, the reach it has, whether the issue itself is long running, who's involved in the story, and why has the story come to be. In terms of other elements to consider for a good story, timing is important. So timing is of importance. So news is very much a reference to modern, up-to-date events happening. Topics that are not new, not newsworthy, will be discarded very quickly. So we need to make sure it's something that happens very, very often. Old news is quickly discarded, especially in a news cycle like South Africa's, where we are burning through so many stories all the time. Social media sped that process along, and if you consider the fact that the kind of nuclear family idea would spend their nights perched in front of a TV watching Notolo Grootboom as you're reading a news bulletin, those days are largely over for young people. So burning through news is very much a common experience, and so we need to be very much on the pulse when developing news, whether that's reporting on news or breaking stories as potential radio journalists. Significance is a big thing. And the example used in our notes is a plane crash killing 100 people is of more importance than a plane crash killing 3 people. I would argue that in South Africa at the moment, we have had a couple of aviation stories break where, there are small groups of people being involved, but scale is important. If a house burns down in Mashadasdorp in Mpumalanga, that's one story. But if 40 houses burn down in Protea Glen in Johannesburg, that's a very different kind of scale, and therefore will evoke far more significance in the minds of those who are listening to us. Another massive feature is proximity. The idea that events closer to us have more of an impact on our lives is a logical idea. It makes perfect sense. If it's affecting us directly, it really strikes us at our core in a more profound way. A good example of that from my broadcasting experience was in 2021. I was in KZN broadcasting from Durbs, and during the process, we experienced a set of floods, and the floods led to me having to evacuate my home. And on air the next morning, I was kind of describing my experience of what happened, and relating to the audience and relaying to the audience what was being done. And in that province, the whole day, our programming was consumed by traffic of reports that reference the floods, and stories of rebuilding, and news reports on whether more rain was coming. Those sorts of things were immediately the kind of precedence of our programming. It became a special broadcast, basically. Whereas if you were in the Northern Cape or Johannesburg, you might have heard about the KZN floods, but they weren't of importance to you, and a show dedicated to that being developed would have been completely arbitrary to the listeners. They would have been exhausted by it very quickly. Similarly, when the riots happened in KZN, that was the eminent experience of being on air that day, retelling that story. Whereas, if you were elsewhere in the Free State, it wouldn't have been something that you really cared too much about, because seen the videos, but your proximity means that it didn't affect you as profoundly. Okay, I wouldn't say you wouldn't care, but it certainly wouldn't be the same level of interest as if you were someone who was potentially a store owner or a friend of a store owner whose shop was being looted. Equally, a good example of this being done in the opposite way was a couple of years ago during some Cape Town fires. I distinctly recall Dan Corder on 5 Breakfast doing a lot of content on the Cape Town fires that morning, which were obviously really relevant to people in the Western Cape, in Cape Town, who could see the smoke billowing off the mountain and feared the safety of their homes and their loved ones and their city. Whereas in Durban at the time where I was, it was a sad story, but no one really cared about it. So to receive that for, a full 3 hours was exhausting and problematic. And so proximity is a really key factor. Consider who you're broadcasting to and make that subject matter to them on account of the proximity. And then prominence is a really key thing. As a rule, the more famous you are, the more coverage you get. Obviously, we can make individuals heroes of stories, but that's generally the formula. Is the more famous you are, the more people care about you. So, when Hansi Cronje died in the plane crash in 2003, the small aircraft fall all the time out of the sky, unfortunately. But Hansi Cronje being the Protea captain, that was relevant to those people. The country had interest in it because it was relevant. People get divorced every single day in South Africa. When Sia and Rachel got divorced, it became national news, and that's because of the prominence of these people. And then human interest stories are very powerful. They discard the main rules of newsworthiness and appeal to the emotions of listeners. It's potentially a way to evoke a more subtle reaction in a person: humor, sadness, empathy. So a person saved a dog off of a vessel that had crashed off of the coast of East London, and this person tells their own story about why they were so dedicated towards saving this dog. It's a powerful factor in the storytelling around this. The other argument that's made is that the two key elements of a good news story is closeness, so proximity, and personal impact. People identify with stories by others, and the more people can identify with the person affected, the more it potentially creates a bigger story. Currently in South Africa, we're thinking about the case of Tebogo Malaka, who is the director of a public fund in South Africa, state-owned. She tried to bribe a journalist with 60,000 rand, allegedly, and the journalist published those findings, and now there's a bit of a legal battle, and it's going to escalate, and she's in some real hot water, it seems. And part of the reason people care about this is the closeness. I think all South Africans recognize their proximity to corruption, not necessarily that case, but how corruption has affected our country generally. And that person was willing to bribe a way out of that scenario. And the personal impact refers to the personal impact that corruption has on your everyday life, which would exist, right? You drive on roads that are pothole filled, and your first thought is, we have enough capital to potentially cover this. Why is it that this is the case? And you probably know that is a result of personal, enrichment by certain parties. Parties meaning individuals or businesses, not political. Then to source news, how do we get news? Where does it come from? Is there some sort of news tree we can suckle on the fruit of? No. Journalists will often find that news comes to them, they're living their lives and they're observing things, and they can start to investigate from a personal point of reference. So Curro schools are in trouble because private schooling is taking a backseat after the middle class ranks. I know that because my cousin can't get their kid into a private school anymore, and they're moving to a government school, and therefore I investigate and I develop a story around that. Sometimes they repackage news stories or pass along news that they deem interesting or informative from a relevance perspective, which is how the press works in any country. There also are journalists who need to find the news for themselves and then reveal to the public, and they want to make sure that they have a story to tell, but they don't know how to write a media release, and so they go to a journalist who can then make that story possible. Journalists will find these stories and then report on their stories, and they deserve to have these published and told to the world. They must be obviously investigated fairly, but fearlessly. Less prominent in radio journalism now. Most radio stations got quite a shrunken newsroom. The SABC does a pretty good job, but theirs is a central newsroom, so it's kind of TV and radio news that spill over, whereas the private radio stations oftentimes have quite a small grouping of journalists. working to bring these stories to life. There's a belief that there can be 15 categories of news stories: conflicts, disasters, tragedies, progress and development, crime, money, underdog stories, people who have triumphed, a great storytelling technique. Virtually every great story is a story of someone who we root for, who achieves triumph after suffering some sort of adversity. Classic story writing. Religious stories, less prominent in mass media, but really kind of topical around Easter time in South Africa. You think about the pilgrimage to Mount Moriah, huge example of a religious story doing well. Famous people, more journalistic: health, sex, weather, food and drink, entertainment, sports, big thing. Sports in this country is huge. And then human interest stories. When writing a news story, it starts by focusing on a couple of key elements. You must, in the first sentence, help people understand of the main points of the story. So as you start, you must sum up the whole idea, like a log line, like 12 to 14 words that sum up the entire premise of it. So as an example, load shedding returns to South Africa after 200 days apart due to maintenance issues. That does the story's overall synopsis in that short sentence. Other information, fine for later on. Keep in mind that in radio broadcasting, listeners are time-starved and doing something else: cooking, cleaning, shopping, whatever. So they're listening to the show while doing something else, and so people are not intent when listening to radio. It's not active listening, it's more of a passive experience. So they are rather just hearing rather than listening. I always say, nobody sits in their room like this, listen to the radio just like this. It's always kind of part of another exercise. So you need to catch them at the first sort of sentence, get them hooked, and then develop from there. When writing or reporting for news, sell the story to the casual reader or listener. Get to the main point really quickly. So if it becomes boring after a little while, the listener still knows what the general idea is and can share that information with those friends and know how to fix them. To achieve it effectively, apply the inverted pyramid style of news writing. This is in your slides, you can have a look at this. And the idea is that the most important information is first, top of the pyramid, and it's a little bit of information. And the more we go down that pyramid, the more we can allow more information to arrive with less we can flesh it out more. The more the important becomes less informative. Sorry, that was weird. We can begin to flesh it out more towards the bottom of the pyramid and tell more of the story for those who are truly captivated. So at the start, small amounts of time, get the most information possible, and you can flesh out the least entertaining details as the story heads towards the bottom of the pyramid, right? So that's the basic premise. The introduction is the lead and the most important part of the bulletin. The perfect intro lead speaks about the newsworthiness of the story, makes people care about it, short and relevant to the main story, grammatically very simple, easy to understand, and able to hook the attention of listeners for later on in the story. We ask ourselves a couple of key questions to drive the narrative: who, what, where, when, and how and why. Who, what, where, when, how, and why. That'll help us drive the crux of the story forward. So we find out who the story is about, what the story is about, where the story happened, when it happened, how it happened, and why it happened. With that, the story develops shape and becomes something we can very easily sell to listeners. And once that's done, you can then ask yourself, is the most newsworthy point included in that story? Is it more than 20 words? If so, cut it down. Avoid repetition and using unnecessary words. Using the active voice, not the passive voice. Put the facts in the first sentence. Make sure it's up to date. And are the verbs in the correct tense? Is it happening right now? Has it taken place, or is it going to happen in the future? Those are some key elements included in this. Of course, in the modern era, you're going to use the modern chatbots to kind of refine your stories. Not a bad strategy, but it will end up making you quite boring. So it's always incentivized to learn your language really well and get good at this sort of thing. For the rest of the bulletin, adjust the language to make sure that it's clear, simple, and concise. Review to ensure that you've used your 5 W's and H. That's the what, who, when, why, and how. And if the lead does not grab their attention, the story's gonna fall flat. So make sure that you make all your real thinking into making that first bit punchy and impactful. Typically, a radio news story is about 100 to 300 words long, depending on how many other stories in the bulletin. Less is more. That's the thinking. Read the story out loud to make sure you have a clear sense of how long it's going to take. A 100-word story is about 30 seconds of airtime. Anything beyond kind of 3 minutes, even 1.5 minutes per story is too long for the radio. Once it's done, you can spend more time on this. Write the conclusion, a sentence or two that sums up the main key points of the story. Check out the whole story from start to finish and make sure that the relevant radio station's guidelines and style and preferences are being implemented, and fact check the script again. Make sure you go back, have a look at the facts, confirm everything is correct, so you are avoiding any kind of issue with any editors if there is some issues with the performance and accuracy of the story. Repetition is the most common error in radio news. Don't repeat yourself, avoid commas. It makes a sentence long and hard to follow and to read along to. Break sentences into shorter parts, so make it simpler all the time. According to Chris Jordan, all copy should be typed in double space to make it easier for a newsreader to deliver live on air. Most of the time now they use a computer, so it's not really that relevant. Include page numbers and write out abbreviations, and then read through it before the time to make sure you know what everything is meant to be said. Rather take the effort to learn the pronunciation is correct than not, Never plagiarize, be objective in your writing, and avoid technical jargon the public won't get. Make it simpler for them to understand. 184, top of in your textbook, top of the page is where this is really outlined, and that's the basic idea behind some news performance.